Good morning. Today we'll be presenting on the similarities as well as the differences with between the British and the French amelioration.
What is amelioration? Amelioration refers to the improvement of conditions for the enslaved people. When did the amelioration policy start? In the French colonies, the amelioration proposal was introduced in the 1830s, while in the British colonies, the amelioration was introduced in 1823. What were the similarities between the French and the British amelioration proposals? Is Brianna in here? Brianna, if she's in here, or Zeta, any one of them.
Okay, so one of the similarities are the hostility of the planters. In both the British and French colonies, the planters were uncooperative with the regulations of the policy. This was due to the fact that many of them were against the ending of slavery. So, okay. Corporal punishment was limited. Corporal punishment refers to physical punishment inflicted on the body of one convicted of a crime or wrongs. Floggings, mutilations, and brandings are some types of corporal punishment that the enslaved would have received. In the British amelioration proposal, it stated that corporal punishment was to be dismissed. Specifically, British female slaves were not supposed to be flogged. If an incident between a male slave had happened, a day should elapse between the time the offense was committed and the time he was flogged.
Also in the French colonies, corporal punishment was also limited. So yeah, that's why I was
Jesus. Anyways. Also, in the British amelioration, it stated that a record of all floggings of over 3 lashes should be presented to the magistrates at quarter sessions. While in the French Caribbean, mutilation as well as branding of the slaves was made completely illegal, which would show that in both proposals, corporal punishment was limited, which was a step in the right direction. Next. The occurrence of Brian, I want to do this one.
Okay. The occurrence of slave revolts. The enslaved people in the British and French colonies had similar reactions in relation to the amelioration proposal. There was a number of revolts in these colonies after this proposal. Such were the Demerara slave revolt of 1832 and the Jamaica slave revolt of 1831 in the British colony. And for the French colony, there were slave revolts in Martinique and Guadeloupe.
The differences between the two proposals. One, separation of families were prohibited. In Britain, one of the amelioration proposals stated that a family should not be separated from each other. Before the amelioration proposals, slave families were usually separated. Most times, children were placed in different colonies from their parents and vice versa. On the other hand, in French colonies, the amelioration proposal did not encourage family relationships. Education of the enslaved. In the French colonies, elementary as well as religious education were
One
compulsory.
thing, Austin, before you continue, remember that when we did French slave laws,
Yes, sir.
when we did French slave laws, the French slave laws would have encouraged family life.
Oh,
So that was something that would not, since they would have encouraged family life in the Code Nord, then it is not something that they would have put into the amelioration proposal because that would have already been a part of the,
already exists, sir.
yes. So you can just make a slight correction to that in the PowerPoint before you send it out.
Yes, sir. Education of the
Excuse me,
enslaved.
sir. Sir?
Go ahead for me, please.
Sir, it would be a similarity then? Or
Yes, it would be a similarity because I wouldn't, uh, the truth is that it did not mention it, but because, and the reason why they didn't mention it is because it already existed
okay, sir.
Makes
in the
sense.
Code Nord. So you could say, if you want to say it is a similarity, you could say, yes, it is.
So you could say it's a similarity, but it wasn't mentioned because it was already being
Existed.
practiced. Okay, sir.
Yes.
Education of the enslaved. In the French colonies, elementary as well as religious education were compulsory. While in the British amelioration, there was no real education system put in place. They were only taught about Christianity. Manumission tax. Manumission is the act of buying one's freedom. In the French amelioration in 1832, the tax on manumission was abolished and the manumission process was simplified. On the other hand, in the British amelioration proposals, the slaves, if they wanted manumission, had to pay just the same for it. Oh, and this is the end of our presentation.
It's a very good presentation. Just make that small adjustments there. Ladies, this question is a CXE past paper question. So
Sir would answer it like that? Like, but
Emu,
add more info? Kind of?
yeah, it's just like how you have it, you just develop it just like that.
Okay, sir.
And you get your full marks. Go ahead for me, Lawrence.
Sir, I was saying that I was going to add that the for differences the register bill, because in the British colonies before they had the register bill before amelioration, but in the French colonies they had it as one of the proposals.
Yes, you could also add that. That's a very good point. Thank you very much. Add it to your presentation, please.
Sir, what you said?
Add it to the presentation, Lawrence point, and then you can send it in the Google Classroom. Post it in the Google Classroom.
Okay, sir.
Next group, N, Bartley, Bud, Curry, Irons, White.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. So this is group 2, and today we will be looking at the similarities between the French and the British emancipation process. Now, this is going to be an interactive sessions. I'm going to ask questions, and I really want you guys to, participate and answer so we can learn together, and all them nice things there. So yes, so let us begin. So, can anybody tell me what emancipation means?
Miss Barkley, this I pay additional attention like that. Miss Barkley, emancipation basically means
Carol, you're really low.
okay, sorry. So emancipation basically means like the words formulate in my brain the fact or the process of being set free. So being set free from any like legal bindings that they have, which in this case would have been slavery. So the process of the act rather, or the process of being set free, or being bound, or being freed from the boundaries of slavery, or slash apprenticeship, depending on how they want.
Right. So that was a really good definition. We love that. So emancipation, as Carol rightly stated, is the process of giving the enslaved Africans freedom. Right. So we're gonna just look at some synopsis of the French emancipation. So does anybody remember when the French abolished slavery? Sorry. Anybody remembers? Okay, all right. So slavery was abolished in the French West Indies in 1794. However, it was reinstated in 1803, and as a direct result, of the Haitian Revolution in 1804, Saint-Domingue, as we know, was the first French colony to declare independence and abolish slavery. The good thing is that slavery was permanently abolished in 1804 in the French West Indies. So it took some time, but they got there. So in the British Emancipation, as a result of numerous anti-slavery propositions, in 1807, the slave trade was abolished, and in 1838, slavery was abolished in the British West Indies. Now, this brings me to the meat of the matter. What are the similarities between the French and the British emancipation process? So before I continue, does anybody know one? Can anybody tell me one? Just a guess,
Both are an amelioration process.
Okay, good. Anybody else? Okay. So one of the first similarities was they both had anti-slavery societies, right? So Britain, we know, had the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which was founded by who? Anybody remember? Have we been paying attention in class?
What's the question?
Does anybody remember who founded, or which group founded, the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade? Okay, I'm seeing Jillian saying in the group it's the Quakers, and you're correct. And we had the London Society for the Mitigation and the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. On the French side, we had the formation of the French Anti-Slavery Society in 1834. And for my French students out there, this was also known as de la Société pour l'abandon l'esclavage. The next similarity was they had, as somebody rightly stated, they had similar amelioration proposals, right? So you had the banning of branding and mutilation. They can't mutilate the slaves, you can't brand them anymore. As the group before me said, religious education was compulsory. You had to learn, right? You had to be converted to Christian, right? Because that was one of the major religious denominations and denoms, right? You had the registration of slave was compulsory. This came through in the registry bill for the British. This was in 1815. Corporal punishment was limited. For example, in the British, more than 3 whippings were to be recorded. The next similarity is the competition from the respective West India interests. Now we know who the West India interest is. Does anybody remember? Guys, it's interactive. Come on.
Okay. The West India interests were basically a group that they were formed because, obviously, as the name suggests, they had interest in the West Indies. They were farmers, families of farmers, and they wanted to keep slavery going.
Great. No, I forgot to ask, but does anybody remember who was the main man in the French Abolition Society, anti-slavery society? Does anybody remember? I'll give you a clue. It starts with V.
Victor.
Victor who?
So can't pronounce the last name.
That's okay, but y'all got the spirit and we love that. So you had the competition from the respective West India interests, right? Planters protested emancipation and they did this by sending letters to parliament and harassing humanitarians. Many persons also argued that slavery already existed in Africa, thus the slaves were used for treatment, right? They were used to it already. It's nothing new to them, right? They said African labor was important to the plantation, so emancipation would result in the loss of crops and the loss of investments. Planters were paternalistic as they provided food, shelter for the slaves. Any argument that they had, they were both arguments were similar in both the French and British, right? Last but not least, you had one more similarity was the Anglo-French right to search agreement in 1818. This was between Britain and France. The purpose of this was to stop the illegal sale of Africans. However, the main goal was to abolish slavery, and this aided in the emancipation process. So, it's a timeline, there are levels to this. And next similarity is after the emancipation of slaves had concluded, the planters had to be compensated for their loss. So we know in the British system, the planters were paid 20 million pounds as compensation. And in the French system, the French planters were paid 120 million francs as compensation. Now, this is the end of our presentation. Thank you so much, ladies, for interacting and answering questions. Those who didn't, I hope you guys answered with your mics muted so we all can learn. Thank you so much. I now hand over back to Mr. Hall.
Thank you very much. Good presentation. Another past paper question. And that's how you should answer it, just like the first group. And the second group, you can add more information to it. But we know for sure that we are on track. The next group is, this group is, no, D will go after R, Beckford Blake, Trishelle, and Hemmings.
Okay, sir. Sir, I just sent you a message a while ago in the chat explaining what happened with one of our group members.
All right, no problem. Go ahead for me.
Okay, sir.
Send me a WhatsApp message. Just copy and paste it to WhatsApp after you finish. Go ahead for me, please, group.
Sure, sir. Okay, good morning, everyone. This morning, 11R will be presenting on the similarities between the Spanish and British emancipation process. So we'll first begin by explaining or outlining what countries were British colonies and Spanish colonies. The British colonies consisted of Jamaica, Antigua and Bermuda, and Barbados. The Spanish colonies consisted of Santo Domingo, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. British and Spanish emancipation in Caribbean territories. Emancipation is defined as the act or process by which a person is liberated from the authority and control of another person. In this case, the freeing of enslaved Africans from the British and Spanish planters. In August 1833, the Spanish Emancipation Act was passed, giving all slaves in the British Empire their freedom. Plantation owners received compensation for the loss of their slaves in the form of a government grant set at £20 million. Britain was one of the catalysts in the process by first abolishing the slave trade in 1808, followed by apprenticeship, and finally, emancipation in 1838 before the United States. The Spanish colonies in the Caribbean were among the last to abolish slavery. While the British abolished slavery by 1833, Spanish abolished slavery in Puerto Rico in 1873. On the mainland of colonies, Spain ended African slavery in the 18th century.
Okay. In addition to that, for the British Emancipation, in the Emancipation Act, children under 6 years old were to be freed. And in the Spanish Emancipation Act in 1870, a law was passed to free enslaved Africans over the age of 70. In both the British Emancipation and Spanish Emancipation, there was bribery taking place. The stipendiary magistrates were put on plantations to protect apprentices from overwork, abuse, and maltreatment from the planters. However, they were bribed by planters to ignore complaints made by apprentices on them. Also, in the Spanish...
One second, this group, 1 second. Did the Spanish have apprenticeship?
No, sir.
Who is saying no? The group, this group?
Yes, sir.
But what about apprenticeship here? For Spanish, it says Spanish emancipation, and they said, like the stipendiary managed. Oh, go ahead.
So I was saying that there was bribery taking place during the whole process of like trying to end slavery and the slave trade.
All right.
So, sir, in the Spanish emancipation process, officials that were placed at the courts were bribed to allow the entrance of slaves into Spanish islands. An extra doubloon was paid per slave. This was shared between port officials, like the customs controller, harbor master, and the local customs officer. As a result, slave numbers skyrocketed, which blighted the efforts of the Spanish emancipation process.
Davia.
You're through, ladies?
No, sir. One of our group members are supposed to be speaking. I don't know why she's not unmuting her mic.
Maybe it's an internet problem.
Okay, I'll go ahead, sir. Okay. In 1838, the Spanish government had signed an agreement that in 1838, the Spanish government had signed an agreement that they were going to end slavery, but it was not enforced. When the slaves in Cuba revolted, Spain decided to take steps to abolish the slave. Sir? Excuse me, sir? Sir?
Yes, Beckford, I'm here.
Okay, sir. Sir, I was telling you that my background was very noisy a while ago. So
that is all right. So we have no control over the background.
Okay, sir. In 1863, the Spanish government decided they no longer wanted to be annexed to the United States because the United States abolished slavery. In 1865, the Spanish abolished the slave trade because they were being pressured by abolition movements such as the Spanish anti-slavery movement. The Spanish slaves became motivated to revolt for their freedom after hearing that the British slaves were freed. After revolts occurred in Cuba, plantation owners began to worry that Cuba would become another Haiti. This resulted in major changes being made in Cuba. British Emancipation. In 1807, the slave trade was abolished in British Parliament after materials such as books, summaries, and arguments were presented to the British Society and Parliament by the British Anti-Slavery Society. After the British slaves heard about what happened in Saint Domingue, they eagerly awaited for the perfect time to revolt against the British and become free people. When the British slaves began to revolt, the slave owners were reminded of the Saint Domingue rebellion. This scared them because they did not want their countries to end up like Haiti. This motivated the British to make major changes and reconsiderations. A series of slave revolts occurred in British territories after the abolition of the slave trade. Countries such as Barbados and Jamaica started revolts because they were tired of being treated unfairly and they wanted freedom. During the period of apprenticeship, slave owners were to train the apprentice to become free people, provide food and clothing. Sadly, slave owners failed to provide adequate food and clothing, and they did not train the apprentice simply because they did not care about them. We know this because the apprentices would always complain to the stipendiary magistrates. However, no change occurred. In 1843, a series of revolts occurred in Spanish territories after the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 because the enslaved felt that they deserved a better life from slavery. During the period of the trusteeship system, slave owners were to feed the apprentice, clothe the apprentice, and train them. However, slave owners refused to do this. Whilst the freed Africans were living with the slave owners, occasionally the slave owner would ask the Africans to complete a few tasks. However, the slave owner refused to pay the Africans. This frustrated the Africans greatly because they were free, and so they no longer were forced to work for the slave owners. In 1835, the Spanish government had decided to put a procedure where they would search and seize ships with Africans. The British slave owners forced the apprentices to work without pay. This was outrageous to the apprentices because they were no longer slaves. They could not understand why a free person would work without being paid. In Britain, ships were searched. The British did this to determine who was trading Africans illegally. Both of the emancipation processes were slowed down because of the pro-slavery groups. This is the end of our presentation. And so you would have seen the message from before explaining why.
Yeah, madam. I have seen it. Thank you very much. Good presentation, Good. Thank you for your effort. Next, Archer Myers Thorpe.
Excuse me, sir. Sir, my problem, I have my stuff now.
Repeat, your problem has been resolved?
Yes, sir.
You can go ahead then for the okay. Banter, Nelson, Husband, and Smith.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. So our group will be looking at French versus Spanish emancipation process. Our group members are myself, Giselle Nelson, Gabriel Osborne, Chantel Banton, and Daniel Ashley Smith. So we'll be looking at the emancipation process from 4 different criteria. What organized societies were founded during the emancipation process? Which lead personalities played a key role in the emancipation process? Was there an amelioration period or transition period and emancipation? And firstly, we're going to look at organized societies. So we know that the emancipation process called for organized societies. So for the French, there was really 2 main societies that emerged. Firstly, on the left-hand side, we have the Society for the Abolition of Slavery. which was founded in the year of 1834. They had a main objective of emancipation, and in 1836 they received a minor victory. A law was passed that any slave that stepped foot in France was free. On the right-hand side, we have another society, Society of the Friends of the Blacks of the year 1788. And they oppressed slavery in North America and the French Caribbean colonies. They also published anti-slavery literature and frequently addressed concerns regarding the enslaved. Whilst on the Spanish side, they had no major society, but they did have minor societies, such as the Spanish Anti-Slavery Society, which was formed in 1865. And as the name suggests, they were anti-slavery and therefore they were fighting for the abolition of slavery. And so similarities that emerge are that both the French and Spanish had anti-slavery societies throughout their emancipation process. Both were pressured to move towards emancipation due to Britain abolishing slavery. And, you know, we would have talked about in class how Britain really pushed for other countries to abolish slavery as well, especially in Spain, where they would have, you know, implemented a treaty in 1817, which stated that by 1820, Spain should abolish slavery, which they did not follow. And some differences emerged. Slavery in the Spanish Caribbean continued far later than the French. And this leads me to my second point. Even though slavery in the Spanish Caribbean continued far longer than the French anti-slavery societies were more effective than Spanish anti-slavery societies. And this was because—
One second for me, Nelson. Did the Spanish had anti-slavery societies?
Yes, sir.
Where
They
you get that
didn't have a major society, but they definitely had societies.
They had societies. You have evidence
Yes,
of
sir.
it?
Yes, sir.
All right, go ahead. Once you have the evidence, that's okay.
Yes, sir. And the slide before, that's actually from online, but okay. And so
go back to the slide. Go to the slide before that for me.
One of the minor groups was the Spanish Anti-Slavery Society.
And you know that the textbooks doesn't look at this.
Sir, but still, I know that, but that's why I said there were no major groups. So I guess that's why they did not mention it, but there were minor groups when you look it up online.
Yeah, and also, I'm not putting down a presentation or anything like that.
Oh, yes, sir, I know.
But this is a very important point here because I believe scholars need to look into this because it makes no sense to say that the Spanish did not have any slave societies. As I said, they were minor, but at the same time,
they were there.
They were there.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for that information.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead for me.
Yes. And regarding the differences, even though slavery in the Spanish Caribbean lasted longer than in the French Caribbean, French anti-slavery societies were more effective than Spanish anti-slavery societies. And this was because the French had major societies and they were, you know, led and they had a belief, they were fighting for it. But, you know, on the Spanish side, they had minor societies and they were not very effective. With the emancipation process, lead personalities or key figures emerged. So, on the French side, Victor Saucher emerged, and he was the son of a porcelain factory owner who was sent on a business trip in 1829, and he took advantage of this trip and went to the French West Indies, and he had a first-hand experience of the deplorable conditions of slavery, and this implemented in him this desire to fight for its abolition. He did this by forming several societies, all aimed at abolishing slavery. He was a prolific writer and pamphleteer, and so he published several writings in favor of immediate abolition. He gave public lectures on the need for emancipation and directed a wide petition campaign. And on the Spanish side, I think the main figure was Carlos Manuel de Cespuedes. He was from a prominent family. He was a lawyer and a plantation owner, and he raised the banner of revolution in 1868 when he freed his own slaves. He also issued an emancipation decree, which basically was calling for the abolition of slavery, as the name suggests. And another personality who was not very much out there, but still, contributed to the emancipation process was Segimundo Prendergast, and he was the colonial minister. He was a former president of the Abolition Society in Spain, and in 1870 he introduced the Spanish Cortes the Moret Law, and the Moret Law wanted to implement the abolition of slavery.
Okay, the amelioration period. So Spanish amelioration proposal, there is no amelioration period for the Spanish colonies, but in the French colonies there were. So the French implemented the amelioration proposal in 1830s as a result of all the slave revolts. Some measures implemented were that there was an abolition on manumission tax, all slaves must be registered, branding and mutilation were prohibited. So this is just a brief timeline on how the emancipation process was. So in 1818, the French government abolished the slave trade in 1880, but in practice, but there was little done to prevent it. In 1834, an abolition society called La Société pour l'Abolition de l'Esclavage was formed. In 1836, they achieved a minor victory when it was declared that any slave setting foot in France must be free. In 1838, the society drafted an emancipation bill, but this was opposed by the West India interest. In 1847, the society issued a national petition for immediate emancipation. In 1848, Victor, as was mentioned before, he drew up a bill proposing the abolition of slavery throughout the French Empire. So this is the Spanish timeline. In 1861, the American Civil War led to the emancipation of slaves throughout the United States and ended any thoughts of annexation by Cuban slave owners. 1865, the Spanish abolished the slave trade due to the outside pressure and the growing abolition movement in Spain, such as the Spanish anti-slavery. But in 1817, they signed a reciprocal search treaty, which was supposed to abolish the slave trade, but that did not come in effect until 1826. But it was still illegally going on until they finally abolished it in 1865. So in 1868, the 10 Years' War took place. This is also known as the Great War or the War of 68. This was a part of Cuba's fight for independence from Spain. In 1870, the Spanish government passed a law granting freedom to all slaves over 60 years old and those born after September 1868. So in 1880, the Spanish government passed a measure for the gradual emancipation of slaves in Cuba. And in 1886, all remaining slaves were granted their freedom. So some similarities, just to sum up everything, is that each movement had a champion, like a leader who stood out and fought for the slaves. Victor Schlechter in French movement and Carlos Manuel de Cespedes in the Spanish movement. So there is no system of apprenticeship for both colonies, but in Puerto Rico, after a law was passed, the ex-slaves had to enter a contract where they worked for 3 years. So that was kind of known as their apprenticeship, but that did not happen in Cuba. So influential slave revolts that played major roles in both emancipations that helped to push the governments to abolish slavery. The French and Spanish governments both felt pressure from the British because the British had abolished slavery way before the French and the Spanish.
and they kind of like pushed them to abolish slavery because it was morally wrong. And in the Spanish and French colonies, the emancipation movement was constantly delayed because once every time they passed one law, it did not come in effect years later down the line, and then it took longer time to actually fully for the laws to fully come in effect. And some differences. So the slave trade in France was finally abolished in 1833, but it was finally abolished in the Spanish colonies in 1865. French emancipation was declared on April 27, 1848. There was a period of amelioration. There were major anti-slavery societies that actually helped to abolish slavery, and the French planters were compensated. But in the Spanish colonies, there was not a period of amelioration, no major anti slavery societies, and the Spanish were not compensated. And the Spanish's end of slavery was linked to their independence. And this is the end of our presentation.
All right, very good presentation.
Sir?
Next group.
Sir?
Go ahead for me, please.
Sir? If you heard any grammatical errors, sorry for that. Just nervous.
That is all right. That is all right. We all of us never born in. Not even the British speak standard English. That's okay. We improve as time go along. All right. We are. Is this Archer, Myers, and Thorpe?
Yes, sir, Paula Ann. Okay, there it is. So, good morning, everybody. Today we'll be discussing the differences between between the British and French emancipation. The group members are Carol Thorpe, myself, Paula Ann Myers, and Felicia Archer. An overview. The need for emancipation will be referred to as decolonization throughout this presentation, but they're in essence the same. The need for decolonization was influenced by several factors, such as global anti-imperial sentiment, reduced resources to manage the colonies in the post-World War II era, and a need to eliminate reliance on resources from the colonies. In some colonies, the process of decolonization was filled with violence, while in others, decolonization was a peaceful process, as we all know, with the various wars that took place. The absence or presence of European settlers in the colonies was the most important factor that caused violence or lack of it during the process of decolonization. In decolonizing foreign countries under their leadership, Britain and France used various strategies that had some similarities and some differences. As stated before, this presentation will be focusing on the differences. Britain's model of decolonization was gradual withdrawal, while France used the integration approach in decolonization. The first difference is the major difference between both of them is the fact the duration it took to realize that decolonization did take place. The gradual withdrawal method was a prolonged process, particularly in colonies with many European settlers, whereas the integration model was enforced within a short period. The drawn-out process mainly took place in the French colonies, while the one that was more speedy in a sense took place in Britain. Slavery was first abolished by the French Republic in 1794. However, Napoleon revoked that decree in 1802. In 1815, the Republic abolished the slave trade, and the decree did not come into effect until 1826. France re-abolished slavery in her colonies in 1848 with a general and unconditional emancipation. So as you can see there, France actually abolished slavery twice, first in 1794 and then finally in 1848. And the William Wilberforce Slave Trade Act in 1807 abolished the slave trade in the British Empire. So we can see that there is a difference of 41 years. And it was not until the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 that the institution was finally abolished, but on a gradual basis. So from when the act actually took place as a 41 age, wow. a 41 gap. However, when it was actually abolished in 1833, that's a 15-year gap. That the institution was finally abolished, but on a gradual basis, since slave owners in various colonies, not only in the Caribbean, were losing their unpaid laborers, and the government set aside 20 million for compensation, but it did not offer former slaves reparations. The second difference was between the two models of decolonization, was the intention behind the decolonization decision. Britain's decision for decolonization was because it had depleted much of its resources after the Second World War, and with the loss of its greatest colony, India. Consequently, Britain was unable to maintain military forces that could control a rebellion in the native lands, and in 2013, the British government understood that it could not manage to continue directly dominating its colonies, although it intended to control the affairs of its former colonies. On the other hand, France sought out to continue ruling its former colonies for as long as possible because it was not prepared for the decolonization process. So Britain basically was like, you know what, I'm going to give you all your freedom because we cannot manage to control you all anymore. You're just draining us, and it's just sucking us out with no of the energy. While France was simply like, you know what, I'm going to continue ruling you because I just don't want to do it. I don't have the mental space and also the capacity to plan for this to take place efficiently. The last major difference is the gradual withdrawal and integration methods, as we were speaking of before, and it was the issue of violent reprisals by the natives. During the decolonization process, violence broke out in British colonies such as Kenya and Rhodesia and Zimbabwe. Of course, those are were colonies in Africa. However, we do know that some of these revolts broke out in Berbice and in Jamaica, where white settlers used force in retaining the lands. Consequently, the natives viewed the newly imposed leaderships with suspicion, and some of the newly chosen leaders refused to take up their positions in government. France granted its colonies independence within a short period of only 4 years, although its colonization of Algeria, that was considered part of France and not its colony, when, of course, we can look into the Caribbean French colonies. Although Britain was better prepared for the decolonization process, its gradual transfer model took a longer time to achieve its goals. Furthermore, the British model resulted in violence in various colonies, such as Kenya and Zimbabwe, and we can mention Jamaica. And the only French colony to refuse its integration model of decolonization was Guinea. However, the consequence of this decision was not violence, but economic sanctions by the French government. The fourth difference is one that I don't really think holds a lot of power over it, and however, it still is a notable difference. This is the very, very last difference. I call it a minor difference. In France, la Société Française pour l'abolition de l'esclavage, or SFAE, or SFAE, was formed in 1834, and this was formed by Victor de Brie. This man was just a man who was fighting for slaves to be free, mainly because he just knew that it was wrong. He wasn't a Christian. He wasn't connected to any other religious group. He was just fighting for this, mainly because of the fact that he believed that this was wrong and they deserved their freedom and that they shouldn't be enslaved. Unlike the British abolition movement, which we know like with the Quakers and such, unlike the British abolition movement, the SFAE was a rationalist and a secular movement, as I stated before, that was just powered and driven by this man, Victor de Brie, or Louis Victor de Brie. He just wanted to fight for this because it was wrong. And the British side of it, the British organizations, like the Quaker movements and the Society of Friends, that was, a Christian organization that was built and founded lots of their arguments. They took, the Bible verses to back up their arguments and help and hold substance. So this is the end of our presentation, the differences between the French and British emancipation, or as we call it very frequently in this presentation, decolonization processes. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Good presentation. Next group. Next group, Britton Lawrence Samuels Williams. So none of those persons are here?
Brittany's supposed to present, but she looks like she's not here.
All right, ladies, please do the last one on your own. So that is the differences between the Spanish and the British. Please do it. It is a past paper question. Go through the PowerPoint and in your notes, you just do the difference between the Spanish and the British. Now, ladies, we are now through, praise the Lord. We are through with Metropolitan Movement. Today is our last class on Metropolitan Movement. We are finished with that theme. So in the exam for section A, you can do Indigenous People and European, Caribbean Economy and Slavery, or Resistance and Revolt. That is A. In section B, you can go ahead and you can do Metropolitan Movement. So when we return in January, we are going to look at United States in the Caribbean. So I believe that's where I want to start, which is section C. And then we can go back to one more theme in section. We can go to one more theme in section B, which is adjustments. So I want to start with US in January, finish US, and then come back to adjustments, because so far I believe that from what I've seen thus far, most of you are very good at Metropolitan Movement. And I am comfortable with what I've seen thus far with Metropolitan Movement. All right, ladies, I will send out your schedule on Sunday, so you'll see the schedule for next week. Enjoy the rest of the week, ladies.
Sir?
Go ahead for me.
Sir, should we upload our presentation to the classroom ourselves?
Yes, you are able to do that. All right,
Sir,
ladies.
should we do it for all our presentations?
Repeat.
Should we do it for all our presentations, sir?
All your presentations, you need to put it in the Google Classroom.
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
Bye, sir. I message you in the chat.
You can upload it on Google Classroom also. All right, ladies, enjoy the rest of the day.
Bye, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Bye, sir.